Welcome. Today is World Children's Day, which is UNICEF's celebration of the signing of the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the Declaration of the Rights of the Child, which is a momentous occasion. And it's a day for us to honor and recognize the incredible work that's been done, but also the huge amount of work that's left to do. As a parent, as an educator, as a human being, I look at the state of the world and I am not proud of the world we're leaving to our children. There's so many areas of inequity, of suffering, of problems that are outlined in all of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that we could be meeting and we are not. And one of those areas that's of deeply pressing concern to many of us, but almost all of the next generations, is what's happening in the natural world, in the state of our planet. And today I'm joined by a group of young change makers who are passionate, thoughtful advocates for making the world that our children deserve, making a world where the planet itself supports our life and well-being. So I'd like to bring in our panelists and ask them to start by sharing one reason why they're here, something that they're feeling about the planet today and the work they're doing as change makers. And so, Juan Carlos, let's start with you.
Good morning, everybody. And my name is Juan. I work on market mechanisms to fast track climate action. And I'm here today because I'm angry. I'm angry because 2 hurricanes have completely devastated my region. I'm angry because the countries responsible keep emitting and they are not financing the adaptation measures that we need. And I'm angry because all these events put at risk the very life and livelihoods of our children and our daughters, our sons, our grandkids, everybody. But also I'm here because I'm optimistic that we can turn this around.
Nidhi, how about you?
Hi, good morning. My name is Nidhi and I'm a high school student in Connecticut. So I am personally feeling very frightened and frustrated seeing what's going on right now. I feel frustrated that not enough action has been taken by people around us, people before us, and that makes me scared of how my future is going to turn out or even the future of my kids in the future. So thank you.
Thank you. Tim, how about you?
Hi, my name is Tim. I work at Democracy in Colour, which is a racial and economic justice organisation led by people of colour based in Australia. I think my driving motion, similar to what others have mentioned, is anger. I think anger at mega corporations and billionaires in the extractives industry that have stolen our future, that have known about the science of anthropogenic climate change for decades, have sowed seeds of doubt in that science. Also, they can continue to profit and line their pockets for greed. So I'm angry at that, but I'm also hopeful at the social movements and everyday people that are coming together to try and do something about this and recreate the future and build a society where everyone can thrive.
And Clover.
Thanks, Josh. My name is Clover Hogan. I am a 21-year-old climate activist and the founder and executive director of Force of Nature. Now, everything that we do at Force of Nature is at the junction of mental health and climate change, and we exist to support young people to really step up rather than shut down in the face of climate change. Why we do that is because we see there's a silent epidemic of mental health problems, especially eco-anxiety in the face of climate change. And so I can definitely speak on behalf of many of the young people we work with to say that I'm feeling incredibly anxious about the state of the world, and yet mixed in with that anxiety, paradoxically, is a lot of hope about the change that is possible. So for me, I feel a cacophony of different feelings, and it's just about creating space for all of them at the same time.
And Gabby.
Hi, my name is Gabriella. I'm a middle school student in New York City, And I'm honestly concerned on whether Earth will be a safe place for me and other people around the world as we get older. And I'm hoping that we could change it and decrease the dangers of climate change so we could see a brighter future.
Thanks. And Britt.
Hi, everyone. My name is Britt Ray. I'm a researcher of the psychological and emotional impacts of the climate and wider ecological crisis, as well as the author of a weekly newsletter called Gen Dread about staying sane in the climate crisis. And I would say that I've felt a huge spectrum of emotions around the times that we find ourselves in. It's ecologically dangerous, and I feel fearful, grief, anxiety, sorrow, but I also feel especially morally violated by how our leaders have been so casual about not taking the right actions to prevent this and allowing the kind of corporate malfeasance that's come from the fossil fuel industry. And I particularly also feel morally violated by just how intensive in a carbon sense it is to live in the system that we've set up. And so seeing how we are part of the problem is also something that can be tough to deal with. And so all of this comes together to create, a sense of radical hope when we connect with others over these emotions and help each other harness them to create the sustainable outcome that we really need.
I think I vacillate between many of the feelings that you've identified, and I think that sense of Clover said it very elegantly, but that just like this soup of all of these feelings and the sense of not doing enough, not being enough, and at the same time, the impossibility of addressing these problems from an individual perspective. I'd like to ask you each to think about a little moment in your life when you said, this work is work I need to do. And we don't need everybody to answer this question, but if we just get a couple of you to answer this question, we'll go on from there. What's a moment in your life when you realized, I have to be a climate activist? I have to be an emotions activist. I have to do something different in the way I'm engaging people in the world in the change that we're trying to make. Clover, I know you've answered this question before. You want to give that a shot?
Yeah, sure. So I was lucky enough to grow up in Australia's tropical North Queensland, fishing frogs out of the toilet and dodging snakes that hung from the ceiling. So for me, nature was never an other. It was always part of my lived experience. We had 3 living room walls and no more. But growing up, I wasn't allowed to watch horror films, so I instead turned to documentaries. And at the ripe, tender age of 11, I watched films like The Cove, Food Inc., and Inconvenient Truth. And it was like having the rug ripped out from beneath my feet. And I think the thing that filled me with the most despair and hopelessness was beyond the issues themselves, just how good the adults in my life were at pretending that they weren't happening. And so I wasn't learning about climate change in school. I certainly wasn't hearing about it from politicians on the TV or in mass media. And so I was compelled and filled with this overwhelming determination to commit the rest of my life to understanding why we shut down in the face of climate change and doing everything that I could to mobilize other people to action.
Gabby, I know you're having a little connection trouble, but it looks like it's working now. Clover just talked about being the tender age of 11, which was not so long ago for you. What got you interested in being a climate change activist?
I've seen on the news the wildfires that were happening and those innocent animals that died and people evacuating their homes, and our president at the time not doing anything about it. So I wanted to do something to help that because I thought it was wrong. I think it's wrong.
And I mean, there are a lot of people who hear something wrong, they see something wrong, and their impulse is unfortunately not to go and say, okay, I'm going to be a change maker. Britt, maybe you could touch on that. What's happening emotionally, for particularly in your research with younger people, that's leading either to action or inaction?
Well, a lot of young people understandably feel a lot of despair and anger, like a mix of rage and overwhelm at the future that they're seeing coming for them, as well as, young people are extremely awake to the injustice that's already happening here and how this unequally distributes people around the world and how it really violates their own ability to have an open future. And so when these feelings are not brought out into a shared setting where people can see that they're not the only one, they tend to fester internally and become very debilitating. It can lead to a kind of paralysis, or just, it's exactly what we don't want people to feel, which is that they're not in this together. So if these voices are not finding each other, it can be a lot harder to deal with the overwhelm of this. But when brought together, there's an opportunity for the emotions to be mirrored, for the concerns to be legitimized, for permission to be given to those heavy feelings. And from there, in that moment of connection, which is really so distributing of the pain, it allows people to find solidarity. Then strategizing can happen about how the people are going to band together, particularly young people, to take a stand in this environment, which is made so much harder because, exactly as Clover said, you see the adults in the room not acting distressed, and it's crazy making to see that. And so in that sense, there's a lot of mixed emotions of rage and injustice that need to be countered by following the group and seeing that you're not alone.
And if I can add something to Britt's answer, I think beyond the psychological component, there's also, a structural component as well, that our political spaces and our decision-making spaces are set up to deliberately exclude young people and other voices from marginalized communities. And that's, by design. It's not an accident, because our system knows that the status quo and our political and economic elite that have invested everything in the status quo maintaining itself, they know that the status quo only maintains itself if the people who are screwed over the most by it are excluded from spaces, are disenfranchised, are kept apathetic. And so I think it's a very deliberate tactic and strategy on their behalf. And so it's not just like an individual psychological thing, although that's certainly a big driver to it as well.
So there's a huge piece about climate change and the lack of action on climate change that's connected, that there's an intersectionality with marginalizing communities, with creating inequity, and that inequity seems to magnify the climate threats in some communities. One, you grew up in such a community. What was your experience of being in the edges of society, growing up in a place that was dry and poor?
Yeah, for my journey in the climate world is quite fascinating, because when I was living through the impacts, I had no words to describe it. I had no idea what climate change was. I had no idea why during the winter my community was flooding, and during the summer the droughts were so intense that all the cattle was dying and that my dad was losing his cattle. Then when I went into college and I got my first job, I got lucky and I got a job at the environmental ministry in Panama. And I was tasked to join the climate negotiations delegations. And that's when I suddenly started to finally connect all the dots. I read the IPCC reports for the first time. And my goodness, I was overwhelmed by all the facts that were highlighted there. And I kept wondering, why is everybody else around me so chill? So I completely agree with what's mentioned about youth not having the opportunity to be in these spaces. And I got very lucky to get into these spaces. And then when I went in to see how the deal was made, how the different negotiators were supposed to represent their constituencies, they were not. They were only representing capital, and they still only represent capital. There are no talks about vulnerabilities. There are no talks about who's going to suffer the most. There are no talks about who is going to be impacted or the emotions. The talk is always about economic gains or economic losses. And that's the big issue that we have. The people making the decisions are not connected with the people that are facing the reality. So the only way to change that is to get politically involved, and us getting to those positions is what is going to make this change. Otherwise, we're going to continue with the greenwashing of big corporations like Amazon with the now Bezos funds that we could talk more about later.
Nidhi, what are you seeing in your classmates? You're an American high school student, and are your classmates passive, active, committed? What's going on with the people you talk to about environmental action? Oops, technology troubles. All right, to come up with a different question right quick. Britt, I wanted to ask you a personal question. You wrote about this, and so I assume it's okay to ask you, but you wrote about struggling with the question of whether to become a mother or not. And I've actually had many women share this with me. What was going on for you in that thinking about having a child?
Well, the personal decision to have a child, we like to think that this is something that's just an intimate choice that we can make with our partner and figure out as, in line with the future that we would like to envision for ourselves. But when our collective measures are not creating a safe environment in which to have a child, we see that we cannot make that decision alone. We need a safe and healthy environment that is not traumatizing in order to allow young children to thrive. And when looking at the scientific data and taking in those trend lines, and then coming home and being with my partner and talking about when we're going to try to start getting pregnant, is an incredibly fracturing experience, because the collective measures that are required in order to make sure that we can protect the mental well-being and even perhaps the physical well-being of that child becomes highly jeopardized, given the 2100 that they would live to if they're born today kind of projections that we're seeing. And so every parent wants to be able to protect their child and allow them to thrive. And when that becomes openly questioned based on what the data is telling you, you then wonder about your own responsibility with that choice. And so for me, you were asking about what got us to become an activist around these issues. It was looking at the responsibility I have to really push on those collective measures and absolutely activate a giant systemic change that we need to ensure that children everywhere, not just my child, children everywhere, are going to have their human rights upheld and their right to a safe future and available food and clean water and good air to breathe and all the rest of it. So it was a highly emotional time to question that, and it has been transformative of my work.
I mean, I think for a lot of times with these sort of big things, like we look at climate data and we look at climate change, and it doesn't feel so personal. It doesn't feel so urgent. On the other side of that conversation recently, I was in New Zealand with my 19 and 21-year-old, and standing at the Fox Glacier, where the glacier was when I was their age, and seeing how very far away the glacier was today, just in the time between when I was 20 and when they're 20. And I don't know, it was a visceral moment for me. Nidhi, you were just lost connection a second ago. I was wondering what's going on with your classmates in terms of climate change. Are they active? Are they passive? Is it hard for you to get people to come to the club?
So definitely I would say that there are a lot of people who know about the climate crisis, know about what's going on, considering the power of social media. Like at this point, everyone is aware of what's going on in the environment. The issue comes in where people are hesitant to take action. They don't want to, like in my case, they don't, even if they're like, yeah, I understand what's going on, but I don't have enough time to join the club. or I don't think that this is my top priority right now. And I think they don't understand that even if right now in high school it might seem crazy to join a club and give time to something like this, but in the end it's gonna affect them and everyone in the future, even if it not seem like it right now.
How about Tim, for you? Your work, as I understand it, includes trying to engage people from marginalized groups to become socially and politically active. And I imagine that many people who are pushed to the margins, it's very hard to then say, okay, I'm going to come into this dialogue. What are you seeing in your communities that you work with in Australia?
Well, there's that common sort of quote about giving a voice to marginalized people. And I think in my work over the years, it's with marginalized communities, it's consistently demonstrated to me that there are no voiceless people. They've just silenced people. And so I don't see my work as trying to get marginalized communities engaged on issues that disproportionately impact them, because they already are engaged in a variety of different ways. I think my work and the work of other activists and campaigners is about identifying the barriers that prevent and deliberately silence these communities, and how do we dismantle those. And I think there are a whole bunch within the broader political space that exist. I think there are a whole bunch within progressive social movements themselves, that we live in a patriarchal, white supremacist, predatory capitalist society, and so all aspects of that society, whether they be our social movements or NGOs and non-profits, environmental groups, sort of manifest these dynamics as well. And so a lot of my work is trying to dismantle and bring it and raise awareness of some of those dynamics, so that our spaces can become accessible and inclusive for a whole variety of different people. And really, like, for me, I think it's absolutely critical that we build movements and campaigns on a whole variety of different issues, but especially climate, that center and prioritize frontline leadership, because without that, we're just not going to win, because it's these communities that can speak with authenticity and moral imperative on the issue, because they're already living it to a very harsh degree. And I think they're the ones that can really make the issue real for a great, for the majority of us.
I saw several heads nodding while Tim was talking. Somebody want to add a thought or respond to what Tim said? One.
Yes, I would like to completely agree with everything Tim just said, because ultimately, the politicians are the ones making the decisions, and the politicians are the ones that provide the subsidies to the companies that are polluting. The politicians are the ones that allow the companies to continue polluting, and the politicians are the ones that negotiate international architecture that will later impact all of us. So we do not have time for on-the-job training for these politicians. We need to make sure that all the candidates that we support and all the leaders that we are training at the community base are already well-versed, so that when they take office, so that when they take to that position of power, they already know what they are going to do, because they are highly informed. As of right now, most of the leaders globally are just reciting talking points that are drafted to them by the technical experts, and they only look at climate change at the moment that they have to create a statement or they have to give a speech, but that's it. They don't get involved with the nitty-gritty of project development or any of that, because they don't see the big picture, because they can only worry about securing the capital for the people that finance them and securing their next political gig. So a big thing that we also need to do is campaign finance reform globally, because unless we take dark money out of politics, the darkness will never get out of the actions that the politicians push forward.
I'd love to jump in here as well, just because both of what Juan and Tim have said resonates so deeply, and especially this idea around there not being, such thing as voiceless folks so much as, silenced individuals. And I see a real relationship here to why lots of young people are shutting down in the face of climate change, and why so many young people feel really disempowered, especially in the context of institutions of power, systems of power. A lot of the work that we do is at the business level, working with business leaders, and we see how much of a concerted effort there is to put the onus of responsibility on the individual. And so lots of young people, and you touched on this, Josh, as well, feel I'm not doing enough, I'm not, I'm part of the problem, I'm contributing to the issue. And that's one of the most crippling facts about climate change, is this idea that we're all complicit in creating the problem. And yet, of course, as much as a company wants you to believe that it is up to you, and there has been a lot of money invested in those ideas and concepts, for example, an oil company creating the very concept of a carbon footprint or a carbon calculator to say, actually, why don't you calculate how much you're contributing to climate change? An individual's contribution in no way equates to the business leader or the policymaker whose decision equates many millions of individuals. And so back to this point around individual and also system change, so much of how we're feeling about these issues directly relates to these systems that have been created around us, the structures created by those in power, and how that relates to the stories that we subscribe to about the change that we are able to create. We can't expect young people to feel empowered and supported if that is not visible, and if the very people who should be taking responsibility refuse to.
Gabby, while we have you connected, how powerful do you feel? How much do you feel you have a voice as a young person committed to climate change?
Okay. I feel very powerful. I get to explain why climate change, what the dangers of not doing anything about climate change. And as a debater, I get to encourage other students around my age to learn more about climate change, and that's powerful.
Thank you. And Nidhi, how about you?
I do feel powerful, considering nowadays social media has a huge voice, a huge contribution to making other people understand the feelings. And I feel like this is where I get to use my voice, through social media, letting other people know, letting other people my age know. And like, this platform has allowed a lot of people my age to get to voice what they think, and also even take charge.
Great.
I'd love to just nuance this dichotomy between the collective and the individual responsibility here, because it's very true that individuals have been gaslit by industry and by our leadership, and that is wrong, and it is not our individual fault, and we're not going to solve this by recycling better or all getting electric cars. We need to get past that mode of thinking. At the same time, I'm noticing in a lot of my interviews with people who are eco-anxious, let's say eco-distressed, that there's something very powerful when they feel violated by the system in which they must operate. When they live in a city that is using fossil fuels to pump their water from 300 miles away, and they walk around feeling like there is no place for them to step to in this system where they cannot cause harm just because of the way that it is set up. And that, which bears down on their life, breeds a kind of rage, a real disgust at the system, which can be radically motivating to try and change it. So it's not about saying this is never affecting me as an individual. It's about recognizing that I'm caught up in this system, which is deleterious towards life, and actively working against my own values. And that can be something that really allows you to see yourself as maladjusted to an unjust system that you then want to change. So I think there's something to bring yourself to life around when it comes to this form of guilt. It's not a paralyzing kind of guilt, but it's I don't want to be part of the system at all. Let's change it type of feeling.
Clover, you've talked about this feeling Britt is describing, and sometimes turning that distress inward and going deeper into paralysis, and yet somehow you've made a different choice. Would you share a little bit about your own struggle with anxiety?
For sure. So I've been an anxious person for basically my whole life. I don't really remember when it started, but at the same time, I don't really remember who I was before I became an activist at 11, so I'm not sure how close the correlation is there. But I do know that for a long time, I thought that my anxiety about the state of the world was a tremendous weakness. And I tried to run away from those feelings. Like, I tried to perform these kind of mental gymnastics to make sense of the world. And I think, as Britt touched on, like, make sense of how alienating it can be when you're kind of like banging the drum and you're trying to sound the alarm, and everyone's kind of sleepwalking toward the cliff face. And so for a long time, I tried to suppress that. And it wasn't until November of last year where I had to stop performing those mental gymnastics, and I had to acknowledge and own how I really felt. So it was, it started with a lot of spontaneous crying, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. So I was crying in the shower. I was crying on the way to work, much to the dismay of polite British society. And I wasn't going through a heartbreak, but I was going through grief. And it was during the fires back home in Australia. So I was here in London watching this kind of black cloud of headlines rolling in, and hearing from friends who were trying to flee the flames, trying to rescue their homes to no avail. I was watching the images roll in. I was hearing of 1 billion animals being incinerated in this inferno. And up until that point, 10 years into climate action, climate change was still something I'd only ever read about. And for the first time, it was something that I was experiencing. And as I watched the fall and loss of my country, I felt the loss of myself as well, the very place that had forged me into an environmentalist. And so that was when I most acutely felt this kind of eco-anxiety, this grief and paralysis. And in that, I found incredible power when I stopped running away from those feelings, as Britt said, because I realized that, in fact, those feelings were a sign of empathy. They were a sign that I cared. And as many climate psychologists would argue, the problem isn't that lots of young people are feeling eco-anxious so much as, more adults aren't. And a lack of eco-anxiety is kind of an indication that we've gotten very good at numbing ourselves to the problems. And we think about all the influences on our lives every single day that continue to numb us. Like, every time I pick up this device when I'm feeling anxious, and scrolling on Instagram, where I'm being told to buy new things so that I can feel more fulfilled and so that I can be good enough, because the underlying message is that I'm not good enough already. So I think there's incredible power in actually creating space for those uncomfortable feelings. And lots of feelings in society are either kind of subjugated into either negative or positive. We're kind of taught to run away from quote unquote negative feelings like anxiety, despair, fear, overwhelm. And yet I believe that transformative climate action, like lifting the consciousness of society, depends on us being willing to look in the face of our grief, look in the face of the damage we've already inflicted on the planet, look in the face of the fact that it is already too late for many frontline communities. It's already too late for the first species to go extinct because of climate change. And from that place of grief, holding a tension between our anxiety about the state of the world and also a grounded hope that we have for the alternative, we can begin to forge our way forward, and all be part of that solution, all be part of stepping up rather than feeling so paralyzed that we kind of stick our heads in the sand.
I'm just feeling a lot of feelings listening to what you're sharing. And one, you and I were talking a few months ago, and I shared with you the story of my older child when they were working on climate activism and getting to a place where their anxiety was so overwhelming and they just wanted to withdraw from that. And I remember at that time you nodding your head with this sense of, I've been there. And you've chosen to stay in this process of being an activist. You've chosen to step in some way into the dragon's den of joining a very political organization. What's helped you stay engaged?
So I've definitely been at that step many times through my climate journey. I started in policy making 6 years ago. And when I did my master's studies about 2 years ago, I finally had some time to like think about what I had done for 4 years. And it was quite distressing because I looked back and I had similar feelings to Clover, and I saw we're still just talking about it. We're not doing enough. Then I was at another organization before the one I'm at right now. And I finally thought I could make some difference. I had a budget of $7 million. I could manage myself. I could implement my project. But then I saw all the nastiness and the slowness of international cooperation, and managing those funds and agreeing everything with the government. And there you had the most vulnerable communities just suffering and suffering because we could not even buy paper for the office. And as you can see, my eyebrows are a little bit uneven because they fell last year, and they fell because I was so stressed and frustrated that I had the money, I had the plan, I had everything to help these communities that were struggling, but I couldn't even buy paper for the office. So last year I had another moment of maybe this is not the thing I want to get into, but if there is a message I want to send through, is that we need to also take care of ourselves. I'm a person that usually prefers to look optimistic, to look happy, and always transmit some type of positive energy. But when you ignore your feelings, your body won't, and they will show off one way or another. And in my case, my eyebrows fell off, and I have to constantly explain people why my eyebrows fell off. But I feel like it's a good example on how we need to take care of ourselves if we really want to keep pushing a strong and ambitious efforts in the climate setting. Also, I almost tapped out a few weeks ago when the results of the US elections were not conclusive. And I was mad and texting my friends saying, if this doesn't change, I might just step out because there is just no reason to be working on this. But I changed my mind as the results started changing.
Yeah, I think a lot of us had a lot of strong feelings about that topic. Nydia, I want to come back to you and this mental gymnastics that Clover talked about trying to navigate all of these different forces. Do you relate to that experience, or what are some of your feelings about being a young climate activist?
I definitely agree with Clover. I feel like every time I go onto my phone, I go anywhere, and I'm like bombarded with like all these like climate facts, and somewhere I feel guilty. I feel like I caused this, and it makes me really, really sad. And I'm like, how can I help this? But there are still moments where I feel very helpless, because it's just having a feeling isn't enough. You have to convert that feeling into a positive one and take action with it. So it took me a while to actually move forward with what I felt. It didn't come along until like 2 years ago, where I had this conversation with my friend, and we literally sat there watching videos of like plastic straws getting pulled out of turtles' noses, and we started crying. We're like crying for like 2 hours, and we're like, why are we just sitting here and watching this when we could do something about it? So that's when I actually felt the change in me. I started talking to the higher ups in my schools, teachers, and that's when my friend and I actually started the club at my school.
Britt, I see you nodding your head. This is a familiar story to you.
It is. It makes a lot of sense. And I think Nidhi's story is great, because what can often happen when we feel activated by the dark, difficult emotions is that we feel, yes, okay, let's try to transform it. And then we get stuck because we only analyze the problem at its holistic scale. And we think about the impossibility of us to make a dent in something that colossal. And what's really key is being able to break it down into very small actions. Like, small is all you need to do. And that can start changing things in a cascade effect over time. So talking to your teachers, talking to your higher ups, starting a club, that's a fantastic way to activate those emotions that doesn't lead to the paralysis that can otherwise set in when you activate the mindset of, oh, it'll never matter anyway. You know, we're just going to have some horrible president possibly not leave office, for example, promoting the burnout feelings that Juan was talking about. And personally, even though that larger systemic colossal feeling is always there because we have to change so much. What I've found to be the most therapeutic is learning to break it down, do the small things that I can, and also take the right action in the present moment just because of the present moment rightness of it without attachment to outcome. So not focusing on what it produces, what change it will be guaranteed to make, but just doing it because I know it's right in the moment, and little by little having faith that over time that matters and that does make a difference. It helps me fight my burnout.
Tim, I want to come back to this question about the intersectionality with racism, with patriarchy, with colonialism, climate change, and silencing people. I mean, I am a white man, I'm a CEO, I'm in an older generation, I'm relatively affluent, and I still feel this sense of powerlessness. And like I don't really have a voice in these changes. And I'm wondering, where is the intersection of this work of change and the work of climate change and the work of activating, supporting the next generation and of anti-racism?
Well, I think it's a good sort of segue from the conversation we were having because, I believe, and this is our approach at Democracy in Colour, which is why we're not just a racial justice organisation, but we're a racial and economic justice organisation, that I think the intersection for all of our issues, including the climate crisis, is our current economic system. It's predatory capitalism. And I think it's important a systemic approach to, well, I think it just goes without saying, right? You can't hope for a solution if you don't have an accurate analysis of the problem itself. And the problem is capitalism, that we live in a system that sees growth as a sole commandment, and in its parasitic pursuit of profit, our economy brutalizes, humiliates, and dehumanizes working people. You're just one example, right? Taking it, following from some of the conversations we were having earlier about climate change. We know since 1988, more than 70% of global emissions have come from just 100 companies. I know that in Australia, if the Adani Carmichael coal mine gets built, we blow our country's carbon budgets, and we blow a lot of the sort of world's chances of sort of mitigating the worst impacts of climate change. The same thing with fracking, both here and in the United States and in other areas where fracking is a big issue. I just think there are so many clear examples where this broad ideology of infinite growth on a finite planet is unsustainable and incompatible with life. We're seeing it with the climate crisis. And I think we also just see it, what this panel's theme is about, emotions and anxiety around climate change. And we just reflect on how our economic system generally, it's created the climate crisis through, rampant consumerism, through the profit incentives that it has deeply embedded in all of our lives. But two, it creates a constant state of anxiety for all of us to be in, because we need to work in these dead-end jobs generally that we hate just to survive, to pay the bills, we're just sort of, the things that make us most human, our ingenuity, our capacity to love, our imagination, they're enslaved to numbers. We just become numbers on somebody's spreadsheet. So I think that's the sort of line, that's the sort of angle we try and take, because I think that whilst these issues disproportionately impact certain communities and certain people around racism and the patriarchy and heteronormativity and whatever other injustice you want to talk about. At the end of the day, I think the vast majority of us are screwed over by the status quo. And the incredibly powerful thing about the status quo and about the proponents of predatory capitalism, neoliberalism, the powerful thing they've been able to do is find the intersections, find the things that divide us and weaponize that so that it gets working people to point the finger of blame at each other instead of each other, it gets working people to point the finger of blame at each other instead of the broken rules. And so I think there's so much more that unites us as working people, as the majority, than divides us. That's, I think, the grand project for all of us, and the grand challenge for all of us is how do we build this multiracial working class movement around the world, and also domestically and regionally, to fight back against a system that works very well for a tiny minority at the perpetual expense of the opportunity and dignity of everyone else.
Yeah, I think there's not a lot to say after that, except yes. Gabby, I'm curious, as a 12-year-old, do you hear what Tim just said? As a Black girl living in New York, what? Sorry, not New York. Where do you near New York? What do you make of what Tim just said?
Yeah, I agree with what he said. It was a lot, but working in group, well, me being of color and at such a young age, and me being able to have a voice, me being in debate, and my mom saying I could do this makes me feel empowered and letting me know that I could do more. And especially speaking on the topic of climate change, that makes me want to know more about the earth and how we could sustain it.
So finding a voice and having a space for your voice to be raised helps you become more deeply engaged. And Clover, you talk a lot about the idea of agency in your work. And so where is agency?
First off, I just want to say, Gabby, it's so incredibly powerful to hear your voice. I'm just like, it only just clocked in my brain that you're 12 years old. That is insane, but actually not that surprising, because I think, we've all been stunned by young people who are just so impassioned and articulate and capable, not just of talking about the problems, but actually beginning to identify solutions. So huge kudos and hats off. I'm just in awe and admiration. But generally, I think, Gabby also really well encapsulates what agency looks like. Over the course of this panel, we've talked about the structures and the systems. We've talked about the emotions that feed into them and that come as a result of those systems, and our self-narrative, our self-concept, everything that we do at Force of Nature to begin to draw awareness to your own sense of agency is around the role of story. A lot of us don't necessarily identify with the word powerless. Maybe we don't feel powerless. Maybe we feel like autonomous kind of agents of change. And yet, by drawing attention to the stories that we subscribe to, we can begin to see how empowered we really feel. And a lot of these stories are incredibly disempowering, whether they are about the world at large or about our individual role in it. So I hear a lot of stories on repeat, whether that's from business leaders saying, well, the system's too broken to create meaningful change, or it's too late, or, we need to maintain the status quo. Or it's in young people often saying, I'm not smart enough or experienced enough to create change. Who would I be to have a voice at the table, kind of thing. And so I think we can very powerfully begin to draw attention to, what is that story that limits your potential? What is the story playing in your mind that keeps you feeling small, that keeps you feeling anxious? It could be that it's too late. It could be that the problem's too big. It could be that I'm just one, in 7.8 billion people. And then ask yourself, what do I need to do within myself to actually challenge that story, challenge that fiction? We've talked about capitalism on the macro level. Capitalism is a cultural story that we all subscribe to. The moment we stop subscribing to the story that money has value, it loses its value, right? And the same goes for all the stories that we subscribe to on an individual level. So ask yourself what that story is for you personally, and then think, what would need to happen? What would I need to do differently to actually rewrite that story? And to Britt's point, not something that is outside of your control, which politician gets into power or which business leader makes a decision, but what evidence do I need to create of my own skills and capabilities to challenge that story so that it can be a story that actually serves me rather than one that disempowers me?
If I can just follow on from that, I think there's a really interesting thing about like what's within our realm of control, and I think the state likes to define what's within our realm of control in a way that benefits them. And democracy in our work, we do a lot of work, programmatic work and capacity building work, training work that works with people who have been taught to be powerless and to feel powerless. And one of the most extraordinary and most rewarding parts of my work is seeing those people like learn and over the course of that program's work, sort of feel their power and realize that they are intrinsically powerful. And I think, I've come to think that you're as powerful as you think you are. And the state has like a lot of like material, has a lot of material ways that it can impact people's lives negatively. But I think like the worst way that the state has in terms of impacting communities is by creating perceptions of a community's powerlessness and creating narratives of a community's role or lack of a role in decision making and in politics. And so I think, when people ask me, like, how do you become politically powerful? Like, you just need to believe you are. And if you believe you're politically powerful, then suddenly you'll start paying attention to, politics. You'll go to rallies, you'll go to your MP's office, you'll arrange meetings, you'll write letters, sign petitions, and all of that stuff. If you don't believe you're powerful, then you won't do any of those things. And if and maybe you not doing those things as an individual won't have much impact, but if 1,000 other, 10,000 other, 100,000 other people believe the same way you do, then nothing's going to change. So I think there is a lot more that's within our realm of control than we're led to believe. And I'd say that, who supposedly represents us is 100% within our realm of control. Everything is, you create your own reality, as they say.
Well, next week we're talking on the show about resilience, and really relates to a lot of what people have been talking about here about how do we fuel ourselves to move forward. And so maybe we could wrap up today by getting a little thought from each of you of your story of what helps you feel that sense of power, of what helps you feel that agency, what helps you lift up your voice. So Clover has charged us to change our stories. So what's a story that you're going to tell yourself from today? Who wants to go first? Juan, what's a story? It's Children's Day. What's a story from today for you about our shared future?
So what drives me to do this work, it's two things. First, the principles that my father and my family instilled in me. He was always a community organizer, and he believed that he had power, like Tim mentioned, to make some changes, and he instilled in me that vision and those principles. And second, my nephew Andres. I don't have kids, and as Britt, I'm also quite thinking a lot about it, having kids, but he's already in this world, and I see every day through my work, how the impacts are coming to us faster than expected and harder than expected. And my story is that I'm trying to prevent as much as I can so that he can live a fruitful life and that we can have, a family life that we can enjoy later on in our community that currently is being devastated by the extreme weather events that have been impacting our region.
Who else has a story for today? Brett.
I think we have so much to learn from other social movements and civil rights actions and things like Black Lives Matter and the success of these movements, for example, which are also extremely emotional movements. What is a Black Lives Matter protest? It is a space of mourning, of coming together, say her name, channeling emotion of grief and loss for collective change that demands a new world, that demands justice. And this is something that I think is really important to highlight in the climate space, because still there's a tendency among activists to say that when we talk about the emotions, this is some kind of internal individual processing, and that, that's really not what needs to be done because we need collective action. This work is from the inside out. We can use these emotions as political tools to recognize what's being lost and what's jeopardized, and then band together over that grief to make collective calls. And so in that sense, it's very valuable. We need to, I think, blur this dichotomy between internal and external and value what these feelings can do for tapping into getting to the root of transforming capitalism, exactly as Tim so eloquently said, which is what we need to do. We need to get beyond growth, and we need to protect people and the planet and not our profits. Emotions can get us there.
Nidhi, what's your story from today?
So after this whole conversation, I definitely feel a lot, really, really motivated to go ahead and continue what I do. And what I would like ask of other people is, even though you might feel powerless, I think it's everyone's responsibility to understand, educate themselves. If you feel like you don't understand something, it's not, you shouldn't give up on it. Instead, go on, ask other people, go on social media, educate yourself. And even if you can't, if you feel like you can't help something yourself, you should definitely spread the word around. And I think that's the best way that people can help this movement.
Gabby, closing thought from you.
I'm answering what keeps me going, right?
Sure.
Okay. One, my mom, she has a huge impact on me, and tells me to keep going. And secondly, my dance. My dance uplifts me as a person, and it lets me feel that I'm beautiful and more.
Thank you, Gabby. And cheers to your mom, who's a teacher. Clover, closing thought?
I suppose the story that keeps me going and that motivates me is, well, it's not a story, it's a reality, which is that there are so many people driving change in every corner of the world. And the people you see on panels like this are not even 1% of the individuals who, without platform, are creating change, whether that is at the national level or the community level. And there are so many young people out there, especially, who will never have the privilege of speaking in air-conditioned rooms or having any kind of audience, and yet they're mobilizing movements as we speak. So I would encourage anyone to really give your energy and attention to those individuals, surround yourself with them, and become one. I love the quote that we can't think our way into new ways of acting, but we can act our way into new ways of thinking. So it's as simple as taking that first step.
And Tim, I believe final word to you.
So what drives me to take action? I think it's sort of rooted in three things. The first one is this sort of fierce, like this keen sense of the fierce urgency of this moment, and this sense that failure is not an option, because the consequences of failure are just like so vast and traumatic, and frankly is existential, that it's not an option for us to not win on this fight. I think the second one is that I think, like with any crisis, it is also an opportunity. And I think the climate crisis, just like all of the other big critical issues we're facing right now, are not just crises to be averted, but opportunities to be seized. And I really believe that we as humanity and as a planet deserve so much more than what we have been giving. That no poverty, that housing for all, that education for all of these things shouldn't be aspirational. They should just be seen as the basic preconditions that a society should meet in order to enable a dignified life. And I really believe that's within our grasp. And solving big critical issues like the climate crisis are ways to get us to there, and to reimagine what a society that works for everyone and that centers dignity and the intrinsic value that humans have. And then the last thing is that, I often reflect on whether we're actually, it's sort of counterproductive to what I said at the start, or whether we're actually going to win this in the first place, because the forces that are against us are just so massive and big, and the vested interests are so massive and big. And I think the thing that sort of gets me going through that, when I think about that, is sort of, regardless of whether we win or not, what does your action, I think the action you take now is sort of a way to sort of speak your values. And I don't know if I'm going to have children or whatnot, but like if I did, I would want to be able to, look them in the eye and say that I gave everything. I gave myself to building and realizing the better world I know is possible, regardless of whether you win or not. I think what you do now and the action you take now is an opportunity to really just say something about who you are in this moment, and who you want to be, and the values that you have. And I think that's critically important too.
And Britt, I don't know if we got your closing thought.
Oh, you did. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
You want to do one more closing thought?
Sure. Just to double down on the narratives and the power of story, because we are dealing with a narrative environment that is foreclosing the future for us, whether we like it or not, because we're focusing so much on the negative and the fright and the loss and the grief. And we also have a responsibility as storytellers to open up what we can think about. Stories present seeds in our minds that then open up new possibilities. And so for some people, they think, oh, that's hopium and that's make-believe and those things aren't possible and you're just fiction writing there. But actually, no, we work towards what we are exploring in our minds consciously and subconsciously. And we also have a duty here to be able to present that more beautiful, just world where we've shifted from a model of domination that we currently have to a model of mutually beneficial partnership with all people and non-human species. And when we start to imagine what that looks like and give people a sense of what it tastes and smells and feels like and what their role is in it, we have a better chance of being able to work towards it. So that's something I'm thinking about in my own work now and my duty as a journalist. How do we do that?
Well, it's World Children's Day today, and this year UNICEF's focus is to reimagine, and to reimagine a world where we really put children at the center of our narrative, where we really put children at the center of our thinking about how we do what we do and why we do what we do. And so as we're here on November 20th, I hope we can all take that into our stories and into our hearts and work in small ways and big ways to continue on this journey. And I thank you all for the work that you're doing in this space, and I appreciate you being here today. Thanks everyone for listening, and look forward to seeing you all again in the live stream or in the real world sometime soon. Thanks everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.